All right, everybody, welcome. So right now I'm going to go ahead and go through a general outline of how photosystems work and how the electrons, which ultimately come from water, are excited to a higher energy state. And this is really going to power the Calvin cycle eventually. Okay, so what we're going to do right now is sort of walk through each of the photosystems sort of with one representation, and I will go ahead and talk about one aspect that differentiates the two of them. So we have photosystem 2, and photosystem 2, oddly enough, comes first, and photosystem 1 comes last. So first thing that happens will be photosystem 2 gets hit by light, and then later on in the process of photosynthesis or light reactions, photosystem 1 gets hit by light. So here's our image of our photosystem. Is sort of a generic representation. We're going to use kind of going off of what we see in your book. Let's go ahead and get some sunlight here. So we're going to have sunlight hitting our photosystem, and where it's going to hit will be in this outer area. So here's some sunlight hitting it. Bam. Lots of energy coming in. And we want to label a few things. So here we're going to go off. I'm going to go off of what you've seen before with your image here in your textbook. On the outside here in purple, we have something called light harvesting complexes. So light harvesting, an N here will help, complexes. That is the purple, so all this area around it. And what they're doing is they're sort of surrounding the central region. That central region, which is shown in blue here, is our reaction center complex. So reaction center complex. Again, I'm abbreviating a little bit here, but you get the sense for the two different parts of this huge photosystem. And this is pretty similar for photosystem 2 or photosystem 1. I'll explain the details differentiating the two in just a little bit. All right, so light is going to hit that light harvesting complex, and where it will activate or excite an electron in our various pigment molecules. I'm going to draw a green pigment molecule, but remember there are different pigment molecules, not only the green chlorophyll, but there were also anthocyanins and carotenoids, etc. So what's going to happen is we are going to have light come in. Light will hit that light harvesting complex where it excites an electron in one of those one of those pigment molecules. What it does is as it lowers that back to a lower energy state, right? It gets excited and then it drops back down. Well, what it will do is it will then excite the next electron, and the next one will excite the next one. And so what it's doing is sort of passing the energy from the light to different pigment molecules. Ultimately, the energy is then passed, not the electron, but the energy is passed inside of the photosystem to the very center. We call that the reaction center complex. Inside there, it's going to hit another couple of pigment molecules, and these are actually chlorophyll A molecules. You can see that here. These chlorophyll A molecules are getting something special. So outside of that, we have water. And what happens is the water gets split, and we end up having H plus ions and oxygen, right? Well, guess what? The electrons, see how these are plus now? The electrons go in here and are picked up. So these electrons go in here, where they receive the energy from those other pigment molecules out here. So what happens here is now we're going to go ahead and we'll transfer that energy to these electrons which we gained from water. So now we're going to go ahead and, using the image from your book, we're going to say, wow, those electrons that ultimately came from water are now receiving the energy from these pigment molecules, which of course receive that energy from the sunlight. So now these electrons get elevated to a higher energy state. That's cool. Now what happens to them is they get passed along to something else. And that is this blue sort of square I've listed here. And what that is our generic name here, but our primary electron acceptor. So it accepts that electron that's at a high energy state. Two things are going to be different now. Okay, that's a general sense for what photosystems do. They take energy from the sun out here. That energy then elevates excites the energy in the electrons of these pigment molecules. That energy is then passed along to these central sort of core chlorophyll A molecules where it excites another electron. And we see where that electron comes from. All right, two things are different. This pair of chlorophyll A molecules in PS2 has a name. We call that P680. And in photosystem 1, we call that P700. And it's just a slight nuance, and it refers to the particular wavelength that they receive. Anyway, slight difference. We don't need to get into it too much, other than to note that there is indeed a difference. Now let's go back and look at another difference. In photosystem 2, we have that primary electron acceptor, and it's not going to hang on to that electron forever. It hands it off. So now, using that other video as a reference, you can see this in more detail. But what's going to happen is that electron will be passed along in photosystem 2 to another molecule. And photosystem 2, it's going to hand that off to plastoquinone. Now I'm going to abbreviate that kind of like I did in the other video, PQ. And that is plastoquinone. Okay, so that's another difference between these two photosystems, right? In photosystem 2, it's called P680, and we are going to then pass along that high energy electron to plastoquinone. In photosystem 1, at the end of photosynthesis, at the end of the light reactions, we pass along that high energy electron to a molecule called ferredoxin, and I just abbreviate that FD. So that molecule is called ferredoxin. All right. Now, why is this important? Well, if you watch the other video, this area here in between photosystem 2 and 1, I'll draw it right here, is going to be important for the generation of ATP. And then at the end of photosystem 1, that's going to be important for the generation of an NADPH, okay? And both of these molecules, ATP, right, and NADPH, are going to be important for sugar synthesis in the Calvin cycle. So what we can see here, if we look back, light hitting our light harvesting complexes where it elevates or excites those electrons in the pigment molecules, eventually passing that energy along to the electrons in P680 or P700, same type of deal, where that electron is now elevated or excited to a high energy state, passed along to the primary electron acceptor. In photosystem 2, that electron gets passed to plastoquinone. In photosystem 1, it gets passed on to ferredoxin. That's sort of a general sense for how photosystems work. Sort of tie this video in with the other videos that describe the entire light reaction in general, and you should have a pretty good sense for things. All right, I'll see you in class.